A container image should not need to be rebuilt just because staging, production, or a test namespace needs different settings. Kubernetes gives you environment variables and config maps for that separation. Config maps have 3 common consumption paths for pods. Values can become environment variables, can be substituted into command and args, or can be mounted as configuration files. The simplest form is env with a name and a value. Kubernetes injects those values into the container environment when the container starts. To debug env values, inspect from inside the running container. The process sees your custom variables mixed with service discovery and image-provided environment values. A small but important role, variables set with env or env from override variables specified in the container image. The pod spec is the runtime contract. Kubernetes can expand environment variables inside the pod configuration using the $parentheses syntax. If one variable references another in the same env list, ordering matters. A variable can reference one defined earlier. It should not depend on a later variable, and circular references are a configuration bug, not a clever shortcut. Use env when you want explicit names or single keys. Use envFrom when you intentionally want every key from a config map or secret imported as environment variables, optionally with a prefix. A config map is a Kubernetes API object for non-confidential configuration. It has data for UTF-8 strings and binary data for base64 encoded binary content. The rule is blunt here: config maps do not provide secrecy or encryption. If the value is confidential, use a secret or another secure configuration system. A config map is not a database or a big file distribution mechanism. Stored config map data has a 1 MB limit. For quick values, kubectl create config map can take repeated from literal flags. Each key value pair becomes an entry under data. When you create a config map from a file, the default key is the base file name and the value is the file content. You can also provide a custom key name. When the source is a directory, kubectl packages regular files whose names are valid config map keys. Subdirectories and special files are ignored. An Env-file must use var equals val lines. Blank lines and comments are ignored, and quotation marks are not special. They become part of the stored value. Kustomize can generate config maps from files or literals. The generated name includes a hash suffix, so a content change creates a new config map name for rollouts to notice. When a pod only needs one setting, use envValue from config map keyref. The environment variable name can be different from the key name in the config map. A pod can pull settings from multiple config maps. For example, one config map can hold feature level and another can hold log level, each mapped into explicit environment variable names. With envFrom, every key in the config map becomes an environment variable. This is concise, but it means key names must be valid environment variable names for the values to appear. If envFrom sees keys that are invalid environment variable names, the pod can still start, but those keys are skipped and Kubernetes records an invalid variable names event. A useful bridge is config map to environment variable to command argument. Kubernetes substitutes $parentheses references before passing the final command line to the container. For applications that expect files, mount the config map as a read-only volume. Each key becomes a file name under the mount pass, and each value becomes file content. The volume is declared at the pod level, and the container mounts that volume. In a multi-container pod, each container that needs the files gets its own volume, mount entry. If you do not want every key as a file, use items. You can select a specific key and choose the path it should have inside the projected volume. One caution: if the image already has files in the target directory, the config map volume mount makes those image files inaccessible at that path. This distinction matters in production. Config maps consumed as environment variables are fixed for that container start and require a pod restart. Mounted config map volumes are updated eventually by kubelet. The delay comes from kubelet sync period plus cache propagation delay. With common defaults, do not design around instant config map file updates. There is also a sharp exception. A container using a config map as a subpath volume mount does not receive config map updates through that mount. By default, the config map must exist before the pod references it, and referenced keys must exist too. Otherwise, the pod will not start. Optional references change that behavior. Optional config maps are useful for feature flags or environment-specific files, but use them deliberately. An empty value can be just as dangerous as a missing value if the app assumes it exists. A pod reference to a config map is namespace local. If the pod is in payments, it cannot directly mount or env from a ConfigMap in platform. Static pods are managed directly by Kubelet, not through normal API object references. Static pod specs cannot refer to ConfigMaps. For stable configuration, Immutable ConfigMaps can prevent accidental updates and reduce API server watch load. Once set, you cannot mutate the data, delete and recreate instead. A common production surprise: updating a ConfigMap object does not automatically restart every deployment pod that uses it as env-vars. Roll the workload when startup time config changes. When config injection fails, debug in layers. Inspect the config map, inspect the pod spec, check events for missing keys or invalid env names, then verify what the container actually sees. For the exam, move fast but precise, create the config map, choose env or volume consumption, verify with logs or exec, and remember that env-vars need a pod restart after config changes. The key model is simple. ConfigMaps decouple non-secret configuration from images. The consumption mode decides names, files, update behavior, and restart requirements.